right, you guys, this is our last little bit of content before your midterm. So we're going to talk about attitude change and persuasion. And then next week, we're going to get into the social influence in the modern world before moving into stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. So let's start off with a little example. We have a guy here saying, I know this isn't good for me, but I really do enjoy smoking. So what is this person gonna do? Last class, we talked about how thoughts and attitudes don't necessarily connect to behaviors, but this isn't really what that lecture is about. Our guy could have 3 different and maybe even more responses or thoughts about smoking. So the first one could be, the Surgeon General is probably being a little dramatic. The second could be, I really just need to stop smoking. But then he could go on to think that smoking really helps me distress, and stress is also bad for me. The reason that behaviors can impact attitudes is based on cognitive dissonance. And this is a topic where I'd really recommend you reading the chapter because it is more complicated stuff. It's more intense stuff. And reading it and hearing about it will help you to understand. The idea of cognitive dissonance theory is that when people experience inconsistency, they also experience dissonance. And dissonance is not comfortable. It's an unpleasant emotional state. This could come from thoughts that are contradictory or a behavior that doesn't match an attitude or a belief. So let's say, for example, exercise is important is an attitude, but I don't exercise, and that is a behavior. Because these two things are contradictory, I'm going to feel a little off about that. I'm going to feel some inconsistency, and I'm going to look for ways to restore that consistency and make myself feel better. In this case, there's a conflict between the behavior and the attitude. So I could either change the behavior to be in line with the attitude, so I could know that exercise is important, so I need to exercise more. I could also change the attitude to be more in line with the behavior and just say that, you know what, maybe exercise isn't even that important. And that way I can stay consistent with my behavior of not exercising. And lastly, you can add some consonant thoughts that justify why the inconsistency is not really inconsistent after all. I only don't exercise because I'm resting my muscles to exercise more efficiently later. Any of these strategies could reduce dissonance because I could feel consistent again. A couple of limits to dissonance. People only experience dissonance when they have no other justification for their behavior. So before we get into an example, your first video notes question is to think of a time when one of your attitudes did not match your behavior. Which strategy did you or could you have used to reduce the dissonance? So now we are going to talk about a classic study in regards to dissonance. So participants are told to complete the task of staring at the wall. But before they start, they are told about the task, and a fake previous participant tells them that the task was fun. They're told just lie and tell the next participant that the task was fun. One is given $1, the other is given $100. Who is going to rate the task as more enjoyable? The $1 or the $100 person? The $100 person experiences less dissonance. I didn't enjoy the task. I lied because I was paid. But the $1 person experiences more dissonance. Why did I tell the next participant it was fun? I didn't really get paid much of anything, so I must have enjoyed it, right? So how does being paid fit in with cognitive dissonance? $10 doesn't really create enough justification for the mismatch in behavior. So in this case, only the person who was paid $1 would be motivated to reduce dissonance by changing their attitudes or behaviors. And since they can't change the behavior, they might start to actually think about the reasons why they like the class or why they like staring at the wall, changing the attitude to match the behavior of giving a good evaluation. This study helps us see that there are limits to dissonance, and people only experience dissonance when they have no other justification for their behavior. If they were paid for it, if they had no choice or were forced to engage in the behavior, there's no dissonance because you know why your behavior doesn't match your attitude. Another example is three people going on a vacation to Disney World. One person spent $500 for 3 days, another spent $1,500 for 4 days, and then one person, their trip was free and they had one vacation day. If this trip sucked though, who would say that they had the best time? The person that spent $1,500 for 4 vacation days because they experienced the most dissonance. So video question number 2 is to describe a time when you worked very hard for something. Did putting in more effort make you value the outcome more? Why or why not? Now we're going to talk about effort justification. If you pay a high price for something in dollars, in time, or in effort, you're going to try to justify the cost of it so you don't experience dissonance. I spent a lot of time or money and effort doing something and it's just okay. Or I spend a lot of time doing something and it's awesome. So the difference between dissonance and no dissonance. Dissonance would happen if you spend a lot or pay a high price, but don't even like the place. There's inconsistency between your attitude and liking for a thing and the effort that you put in to experience it. If it turned out to be disappointing, that would feel bad. So you're motivated to make sure that it doesn't feel disappointing. You'll justify all of the effort that you put into the trip by bringing your attitude in line with the effortful behavior and saying that it was worth it. The harder that you work for something, the more favorable your attitude will be towards it. Otherwise, your behavior doesn't really make any sense. You worked too hard relative to how much you care about it or like it. This may explain a lot of things that seem unexplainable at first look. The more pledges have to go through, the more committed they are to the fraternity. PhD students like research, but it's hard and it's annoying. So if that's the case, then why are PhD students here? Because we like the work and the effort for a desired outcome. This might even explain why your parents love you. Being a parent is a lot of work. If they didn't love you, they'd have no good explanation for all of the effort and money that they spent. So I guess it's important that they better love you. The harder something is, the more favorable attitude you have toward it. Cognitive dissonance also impacts how we think. We might experience dissonance after making a decision, so we have to rationalize it. After deciding to come to SU, you focus on the great athletics, the Greek life, opportunities, the awesome professors, and you thought about all the traffic you would have had to deal with at NYU. The negative features of Syracuse are inconsistent with the choice you made to come here, so as long as your decision isn't reversible, you're likely to try to see the positive here and rationalize your decision to come here. And positive features of NYU are inconsistent with your choice to not go there, so long as your decision isn't reversible. You're likely to try to see the negatives of NYU as part of rationalizing your decision not to go there. System justification. So this is when people believe that the world is or should be fair, and seeing evidence of inequality is going to cause dissonance. So then you could reduce this dissonance by trying to enact change or to make the world more fair, or to justify the status quo of oppressive and unfair systems. So system justification is the tendency to justify existing systems because that's easier than bringing about real change. And this relates to the idea of belief in a just world where people get what they deserve and they deserve what they get. And when you see that the evidence doesn't align with that view that the world is just, you actually blame the victim. And it makes it seem like they did actually get what they deserve because the world really is just. So we talked about that in relation to victims of Hurricane Katrina and its flooding. Another way consistency and inconsistency matters with regards to our attitudes is in the relation to other people. This idea is called balance theory, and balance theory uses 3 strange little triangles to explain what's going on. So bear with me as I try to explain to you what's going on. So P is person, and that's going to be me. And then we have these positive and negative signs to indicate whether there's a positive or a negative attitude. But she really likes the Ravens. So we can see the connection from me to Dr. Sarah Burke, and then from Sarah Burke to the Ravens. But unfortunately, I really like the Eagles. So this is creating an inconsistency. I like Sarah, but we feel differently about the Ravens. So this could create discomfort. So there are a lot of opportunities to restore this balance when the attitudes don't align. I could tell myself, it's just football. We have a lot of stuff in common, so this inconsistency doesn't really matter. I could add consonant ideas and I could say, well, Sarah is more of a volleyball fan anyway. So her liking the Ravens is really just based off of where she lives. So I could change the attitude or I could change my behavior. So if I change my attitude, then I could say, I don't really like Sarah. I actually prefer to disagree with her. There's no reason for us to like the same things. And since I dislike her, I'm actually going to disagree. So this would be changing my attitude. Remember, because my initial attitude towards Sarah was positive. This would be an example of if it was negative. But then if I was going to change my attitude towards the Ravens, I might decide that this is my favorite team moving forward. So I change my attitude towards X instead of towards O. And this is just another way that our attitudes changed based on cognitive dissonance because of other people who we care about. So think about if this extended to other people, friends, family. How are your attitudes changing? If you created a bigger network, how would you see your attitudes changing towards different things? It's important to think about things in that way. Moving on to persuasion, we've talked so far about how attitudes form naturally. So we've talked about affectively based attitudes or attitudes that are based on emotion and reactions and conditioning. We talked about cognitively based attitudes. So these are ones that are based on beliefs. And then we've talked about behaviorally based attitudes. So based on observing your own behavior or justifying one's own behavior to minimize dissonance. So now we're going to move into persuasion. So we'll be thinking about the how, the why, the when as to why people change their attitudes in response to specific, direct, persuasive intent. For the rest of today, we're going to focus on the experience of being persuaded. Video notes question number 3 is to think about the last advertisement or social media post that influenced you. What made it persuasive? There are 2 routes to persuasion. We're going to use a metaphor related to vision to explain them. In your vision, in each eye, you have central vision and peripheral vision. Your central vision is whatever you're directly looking at, whatever you're intending to see, you're intentionally directing your gaze there. But your peripheral vision is what you see around the edges, not what you're focusing on, but what you can still see. Similarly, when we talk about persuasion, there are 2 routes to persuasion, the central route and then the peripheral route. So the 2 routes to persuasion. First, we're going to talk about central. This means that I'm going to think carefully and deliberately about the content that's in front of me. I'm evaluating the merits and flaws of the argument. But the peripheral route is going on without much thought. I'm being influenced by factors other than the message content that I am evaluating, the message content that I am critically thinking about. Attending to relatively superficial, easy to process information that is tangential to the persuasive argument. Video notes question number 4 is to give an example of peripheral information used in persuasion. So how do advertisers or anyone that's trying to persuade you, what do they use in the periphery to persuade you? What are some examples of the things that we might see being used? So we talked about celebrity endorsements last class, but here is another example of that. So the central route or the message content is that Aveeno is going to make your skin healthier by sealing in moisture. But the peripheral route or the other factors here are the celebrity endorsement. So Jennifer Aniston, if you like her, if you have positive feelings about her, then you might also have positive feelings about this product. It's colorful, it's cheerful, she's smiling, it's positive. And then you also might think that Jennifer, if you like her, if you have these positive feelings towards her, you might view her as credible or authoritative. And we know that this is just like a screenshot or a print and that there are other ways to advertise. So just think about all the ways that mediums change and how the central and peripheral routes can also change as well. We want to understand which route people are going to use or which route is going to be more effective. So if the issue is personally relevant to me and I'm knowledgeable in that domain, then I'm likely to use the central process to really focus on the quality of the argument. But if the issue is not personally relevant and I'm not motivated to understand, if I'm distracted or fatigued, or if the message is incomplete or hard to comprehend, then I'm going to be more likely to use the peripheral route. When people are using the central route, they'll be convinced when there is a strong quality of the argument. When people are using the peripheral route, they don't care as much about the quality of the argument. It's more about the attractiveness, the fame, the expertise, the number and length of the arguments, and the general consensus that people are having. Peripheral starts to become more convincing if the speaker is famous or if there seems to be a lot of arguments, and it also seems that a lot of people are on board. Video notes question number 5. When are you more likely to rely on an expert's opinion rather than carefully evaluating the evidence yourself? So for this scenario, imagine you are asked to vote on the following policy. Students graduating Syracuse University must pass a comprehensive exam their senior year covering content from all 4 years of study. Here are the options that we have. A good argument and the policy is 10 years away. A bad argument and the policy is 10 years away. Or a good argument and the policy begins this year, and then a bad argument and the policy would also begin this year. So this study is testing that idea. They were looking at the policy about requiring a comprehensive exam as a graduation requirement. So when the message is personally relevant, the argument strength matters. So for these students, it would have applied to them before they graduated, so it was personally relevant. But then when the message is not personally relevant, so meaning it would start in 10 years and it doesn't really affect the current students, the argument strength doesn't matter as much. So in this study, people either had strong or weak arguments, and it shows that people are using the central route and paying attention to the argument strength only when the issue is personally relevant to them, or they are more motivated to get it right. So we have an argument by a Princeton professor or an argument by a 10th grader, and then we see that the policy is 10 years away or beginning this year. So again, they also manipulated the expertise of the source or who was giving the message, which is a peripheral factor. Half were told that the arguments were generated by a local high school class, and the other half were told that the arguments came from Carnegie Commission on Higher Ed, allegedly chaired by a Princeton University professor. Now we can see that the apparent expertise matters when the issue is not personally relevant. So the evidence here shows that people are relying on the peripheral route. So again, when the message is personally relevant, the expert source doesn't really matter, because if it's relevant to me, I feel like I know enough to not need an expert. But when the message is not personally relevant, you really, really want to hear from an expert source to make your argument. Another way that things can be persuasive is through the sleeper effect. So I know that I'm not a fashion expert, but even so, I tell the whole class that the hottest new trend is going to be micro patterns. Will you listen to me? Maybe not, but over time, you might forget that the source of the information is me, and you might assume that you heard the information from a reliable source. So the sleeper effect tells us that messages from unreliable sources exert little influence initially, but over time have the potential to shift people's attitudes. Initially, you discounted it because you remembered the source, but ultimately you forgot that you heard it from me. Maybe I heard it in Style or Vogue. These are probably true. Like Zendaya would definitely say something like this. So maybe that's where I heard it. That's an example of the sleeper effect. Now we're going to talk about persuasion in the way that it relates to health. So we wanted to mention this because it's a callback to framing, and we talked about the ways that people say things affect the way that they are perceived. When we're trying to persuade someone to exercise, we could frame a persuasive argument in 2 different ways. So we could have a gain frame, emphasizing the potential benefits of the behavior, meaning that I could say exercising regularly can lower your risk of heart disease. Or there could be a loss frame, showing the potential consequences of not engaging in a behavior. Not exercising regularly can increase your risk of heart disease. Another example of the gain framing would be getting a mammogram can lead to early breast cancer detection, and loss frame would be not getting a mammogram can leave breast cancer undetected. So loss frame usually poses a little bit more risk. One more example of gain frame is that washing your hands can prevent coronavirus. But loss frame would be not washing your hands makes you more susceptible to coronavirus. Video notes question number 6. When should we use the gain frame? And then when should we use a loss frame? And as a reminder, they're up here on the screen, but gain frame likes to point out the potential benefits of a behavior, whereas loss framing shows the potential consequences of not engaging in a behavior. What they argue is that gain frame will be especially effective for low-risk health behaviors like exercising or hand washing or other preventative behaviors because people want to gain the benefits. They want to be able to prevent something bad. Loss frame is more effective for high-risk behaviors, getting a mammogram or other high-risk outcomes that you want to be able to detect because people don't want to risk losing everything. Another way that people are encouraged about health behaviors is through fear. It's really dangerous to smoke, or not using sunscreen can cause cancer. But inducing fear can be tricky because it can lead to two different responses. Danger control response equals changing the behavior. When people feel fear, they try to control the danger by changing the behavior, like quitting smoking or wearing sunscreen. But the fear control response tells us that when people feel fear, they try to control their fear response by denying, avoiding the information, or trying to refute it. Those are the types of ways that a person would justify their reaction or their response to fear. The sun isn't that dangerous. Sunscreen was only invented recently. Or I could stop watching sunscreen commercials altogether. I don't buy any of that evidence. It was paid for by sunscreen companies. In regard to health, though, specifically, what we would want is the danger control response. We want consumers to fix the behaviors that could harm for them or align with behaviors that are better for them. When people know what they need to do to avoid the threat, they can work to control the danger. What response you have depends on the perceived efficacy. Do people even think that they can do something about the threat to begin with? Returning to something you probably saw in the textbook, why do you think the fear and instruction had the best effect on reducing cigarette smoke? Fear gets people to act, and then fear with instruction helps people to have the efficacy to know what to do. So remember also when we talked about specificity and how each time things were getting more specific, the behaviors are also increasing with that. So this is very similar, that yes, fear got people to start behaving, but then once we give them more instructions or once we get more specific, that is the most effective treatment to stop smoking or to reduce smoking. That is all of our content for today. As a reminder, midterm review is tomorrow. Come to class prepared with any questions that you may have so that we can clear those all up before your midterm exam opens for you tomorrow afternoon. The access code for the 7:15 quiz is up on the screen. Remember that your quiz is due by 11:59. But also remember that your video lecture notes are due by 11:59 as well. And I will see you all for class tomorrow.